Booz Allen is delivering mission-ready solutions, AI-powered, software-defined, and commercial-first. Combining deep mission experience with commercial partnerships, Booz Allen is defining a new defense industrial base, a network that crosses traditional boundaries to scale non-traditional technologies and brings our best tech to the hands of the warfighter faster, effectively delivering technology for today and tomorrow. Booz Allen, accelerating outcomes for today's warfighters.
Hello, and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Seraphin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. On today's episode, we're going to explore the Pentagon's pursuit of JADC2, the Combined Joint All-Domain Command and Control System. It's an effort by the Department of War to connect sensors, shooters, and decision makers across all domains for military operations. It's an amazingly complex challenge, connecting new and existing systems in a complex network of networks, all in contested physical, virtual, and electromagnetic environments. So, how does the department really address the many challenges that it's going to face when it's trying to deploy a network of complex command and control systems in operational environments? How can new technologies help overcome some of these challenges? How do we get Pentagon culture and process out of the way as we're trying to do all this? To help us think about these issues and walk through some of these challenges, we have two very distinguished guests that I'm pleased to welcome to the podcast, Dr. David Bray and Ms. Courtney Stiles. David is a returning guest who is, among other things, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and a director of the Stimson Loomis Accelerator program. Courtney is the executive director for customer activities at REDCOM laboratories. David, welcome back. And Courtney, welcome to today's podcast.
Thanks for having us, Arun.
Yes, thank you.
So, David and Courtney, I didn't do either of you two justice with your background, so I'm putting you on the spot now. I'll start with David. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you came into thinking about these JADC2 problems.
Well, thank you, Arun. I often say I was crazy enough to fall on my head at a young age, and that made all the difference. But the slightly more detailed version, I started working for the U.S. government when I was 15. And initially, it was at a Department of Energy facility, but fast forward to the mid-90s, so you can guess my age from there. It was with components of the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization. So even then in the mid-90s, it was how could we use satellites not only for communications, but early warning networks, and how do we respond? Later, did bioterrorism preparedness response, did what everyone does after responding to the events of 9/11 and Anthrax, got a PhD in the business school. And then after getting that, went to Afghanistan. And I think that's probably when I first started to wrestle with this. There were two competing theories of how to do at the time what was called just JADC2. We didn't have to do the combined yet. And it was really the idea of, do we do it top down? Because then at least we can have uniformity, or do we do more bottoms up? And I think the military was, for various reasons, leaning towards top down approaches. And everything I had seen when I responded to Anthrax events in 2001, responded to the original coronavirus SARS, was that top-down kills if the environment is turbulent, let alone denied attempts to actually take it down and things like that. And so early on, I think you and I, actually that's probably about the time you and I met when I was ghostwriting papers with the Science Technology Policy Institute, I think you were at OSDP, was really trying to push for we need instead this more bottoms-up approach that could actually connect when things permit. But I think the last 15 to 20 years have caused us to think that top-down works only because our competitors had nowhere near the capabilities that we have. But now that we're going into a world where we have near-peer adversaries, I feel like we've got to call this out and say top-down will probably not last more than 5 or 6 minutes. But if we do a bottoms-up approach, we can work when we need to, and we can connect when we can, but we can also fail gracefully, which I think is going to be a key feature of what we need to do.
That's great. Courtney?
Well, thank you guys for having me. I feel a little bit like Alice in Wonderland, fell down the rabbit hole, with the caliber and likes of you two. I am Courtney Stiles. I'm executive director with customer activities with REDCOM laboratories, and we manufacture command and control solutions that actually work. We focus on increasing the operational flexibility, interoperability, and mobility of those systems, while at the same time reducing those life cycle maintenance and training costs. And so my personal, story is a little bit unconventional. I began my career actually on the commercial side before transitioning to the government and federal space. And because of that, it's really given me a broad perspective on how both worlds operate. And really, my superpower is really just intellectual curiosity. I'm always asking why, or perhaps more importantly, why not, especially when it comes to challenging the status quo. And certainly with this conversation and the work that we do at REDCOM with a lot of our government customers is, we have a lot of conversations kind of about what's concept, what's real, and what we actually need in the next, future fight against a near peer adversary, as you say, Dr. Bray. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for having me here.
And I'm going to call Courtney out for being way too humble. But I realize, she was being polite. REDCOM's got some really interesting customers that you've had for some time. So this is something where you've had to work in environments that absolutely have to succeed. Because if they don't, really bad things happen. But also, Courtney, I'm going to call out, if you can say real quick, I saw a demo recently where I think you had a 1950s, we're talking Korean War MASH era crank radio that was able to connect to a VoIP phone, that was also able to connect to a satellite phone, that was also able to connect to a cell phone that was fingerprinted so that only the right cell phone could call in. But talk a little bit about that capability, because again, I think that helps people understand what a bottoms up approach is versus a top down.
Yeah, as you say, we've been doing this for 40 plus years. And so the demo that Dr. Bray is talking about is exactly that. We were able to take and show a wide range of end devices, right? So he talked about a World War II crank, field phone, to an IP phone, to an SDR radio, to also, just black gear, like a Motorola or a Kenwood. And so what we are able to show, and what we showed with that, is how essentially we are able to use any device or any network that's out there, and we're able to go ahead and bridge the gap. That's really our bread and butter, is being able to bridge the gap between those disparate endpoints, and between those disparate organizations, and between those disparate technologies, right? And so one of the cool things about that demo, and what it certainly showcased, was the fact that, it was using an IP connection. And then we simulated the network going down, and we just physically pulled the plug of that connection, and that call stayed up, and it just switched over to using a different transmission path. I think at the time it was using a Charles Ware Manet mesh network connection. And so the end user really didn't even know that had happened. And so a lot of times in certain conversations, you want to know, right? So that way, that you're being targeted, and there's certain ways that we can do that. But then in other ways, the warfighter at the end of the day doesn't necessarily care which network they're using. And they just want to make sure that they can get the message out and they can get the message across. And that's certainly, what we're able to do for our customers, or an example of what we're able to do.
Thanks, Courtney. That's great. So to level set for the beginning of the conversation here, then, David, let me just ask you, explain to the layperson what exactly JADC2 is, and why is it apparently such a high priority for the Pentagon these days?
Sure. So I believe the original incarnation of JADC2 that then became JADC2 was the necessary communication interoperability across the different services, thus the joint all domain, and thinking about not just sea, not just air, not just ground, but also thinking in terms of cyber and space contexts for command, and be able to get both information in, but also commands out to basically operate on the battlefield. It has evolved since. The combined part now is talking about interoperability with our friends and allies. So not only the English-speaking partners, but also NATO, allies in the Pacific. And I'm seeing right now, I don't know if it's scope creep or it's just recognition that it's not just about communication anymore. It's also about data from sensors, data from platforms, imagery, and the like. And so it really is the idea that in the case of our Department of War, they can have visibility across all the services, but then similarly, a operational picture is possible with our friends and allies in a conflict for the purposes, and I think this is really what's key, for the purposes of having combined effects on the battlefield so that I can bring my air resources, my ground resources, my naval resources, my cyber resources, my space resources, even my information operations resources to bear for combined effects, with the theory that combined effects are much more effective than individual effects by themselves.
So when you describe that, honestly, it doesn't sound tremendously new, right? When I first, 10 years or 15 years before we met, we were writing legislation on what we used to call network-centric warfare.
Correct. Right.
Is it that much different than what we used to call network-centric warfare?
I think it's very much similar. I think it is that the pursuit of it has been an ever it's like nuclear fusion. We're only 10 years away. Maybe it's something like that. And so I think it's not different in concept, but it's that we have been pursuing it, and we have been pursuing it while also facing adversaries that are changing in their capabilities. And so that is a reality. The other thing that makes it interesting and more challenging is 12 years ago in 2013, I believe we ended the year with officially 1,165 operational satellites in orbit 12 years ago. We're going to end this year probably with more than 14,000, so more than 10 times the number of satellites that are in orbit, of which more than 75% are ours. We're up to like 9,000 are US launched. But making sense of those satellites, but then also being aware that adversaries get a vote with what they may do in space and how they may actually either intercept comms or jam comms and the like. We've seen in the Ukrainian conflict that jamming is we should assume that jamming is going to happen. And so I think it is the same concept from the 90s, from 2000, from 2010, but it's also recognizing that, as the ability to send video imagery, send images, that's increased the bandwidth considerations, the latency considerations, but then also adversaries have gotten more sophisticated. And then the last thing I'll say is it's not just space assets. We are now living on a planet where, again, 12 years ago or so in 2013, there was about 7.1 billion human beings on the planet, 7.1 billion network devices, not all connected to the internet. And now, just 12 years later, we're at about 50 billion network devices relative to 8.2 billion human beings. And so I think one of the things the Department of War and others have to take in consideration when we talk about JADC2, how do you know which devices can do what? How do you know if they have been compromised or not? To me, the most insidious situation in JADC2 is not that it goes down or we lose comms. It's that we think we still have secure comms when in fact it's an illusion.
Courtney, when you think about something like JADC2 and connecting all of those nodes, we'll call them, that David's talking about, whether they're assets in space or sensors on the ground or platforms flying around or whatever it is, I could see why the Pentagon hasn't achieved it, right? There's budget issues and cultural issues and technical challenges. And, oh, by the way, someone's shooting at you and jamming you and that kind of thing. But can you at least give me some hope that there's some commercial analog here that we can, oh yeah, this has been done. This is not impossible, at least technically. Think about this commercial example. What is any commercial equivalent to what we're thinking?
Yeah. And I mean, it's everything you guys say, right? It's a hard problem, right? There's certainly so many different aspects, and the scope of it is so wide and large. And certainly coming at it from a interoperability, perspective, right? Because essentially it's wanting to share information with, as you say, our coalition partners and our mission partners, that we work with, and trying to do it, in a new and different way. And so, there's a lot of tension from an interoperability perspective between, any immediate and future needs, right? So there's always going to be this tug between, the operators and the planners, so folks that are concerned maybe more with the capabilities of today's system in the short term, where planners are more concerned with the capabilities of tomorrow's system. There's tension between local and global needs, right? So kind of people up at the strategic level versus folks, down more at the tactical level. And certainly when you're in a unit, and you need to communicate to someone and something's not working, they're strongly motivated to solve a lot of their own pressing problems, which sometimes makes it much harder for them to interact with other units, right? And there's inability to anticipate a lot of the relevant scenarios for use, right? So it's really hard to come up with a solution, especially, from a top-down perspective, and really anticipate a lot of the relevant scenarios for use, right? There's the saying of, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that's certainly true for a lot of what our warfighters face. And so there's just tons of different reasons throughout history. Legacy systems, stovepipe systems, the integration of current and future systems, rapid technological change, right? I mean, at any point, you've got a third of the forces getting ready to be deployed. You've got a third of them actually out on deployment, and then you've got a third of them coming back. So there's this cycle when people are either upgrading new software or new solutions, and all of that is really tough and all of that is really hard. But to get back to your, kind of question of, is this possible today? I mean, the answer really from a technology perspective is yes. This is possible, right? This isn't necessarily a technology problem. It's more of a how problem, and what's the right way to implement it, and what's the right policy, and what's the right organization. And then once you kind of start looking at that, and once you've got kind of the implementation or the how down, it becomes a lot easier from a technology, perspective. But, at least in my mind, a lot of what's hard, even from an interoperability perspective, and why is this, still a challenge, is it's because we don't buy a lot of interoperable solutions. We don't buy a lot of standard-based solutions, right? So a lot of the incentive for companies to adhere to those, so that way they can, share information with folks more easily, is not necessarily there. So that's certainly one thing, we as a collective, with the government and with our country, can do a better job of is, things that are important to us. If we say they're important to us, we should make sure that we put the money behind, the buying, because or else the businesses just aren't going to follow.
And I know, Arun, you've had some other emerging podcasts, technology podcasts that I really liked, where you had Evan Fortunato talk about MOSA, Modular Open Systems Architecture. And I think it's sort of an interesting, similar conundrum here, which is if you wait for industry to come up with the perfect suite of standards to achieve JADC2, we'll be here for another 10 years. But what REDCOM and others have done is they're doing interoperability between two different systems, and they're doing it at the software level as opposed to the hardware level, because these things are going to change, they're going to evolve, and I think that is the more realistic approach, and actually building that in. But I realize that for different folks, for a while, there was the idea that standards will save us all. Having served on standards development organizations, I say standards are like toothbrushes. Everybody says they want to use one, they just don't want to use anybody else's. And so it creates a problem. But then also with MOSA, I mean, I do talk to people who are somewhat MOSA skeptics because they've seen what I don't think you or I or Evan would say is MOSA, but it's MOSA where they have thrown in digital twinning and they've thrown in DevSecOps, and they've made it way more complicated than it needs to be. So if anything, I think my recommendation to the Department of War would be keep it simple and just say what we're looking for is secure, interoperable across these different platforms. And again, we're not looking for the magic suite of standards for time immemorial. And we're also not looking for digital twinning or DevSecOps, because that might be nice to layer on top. But let's first just be able to have the ability to get information to a commander and vice versa to someone that's in the field or in the battlefield. But we've seen the same problem when FirstNet was rolled out in the United States domestically with emergency responders. And so I think this really is, at the end of the day, how do you provide capabilities leveraging the strengths of the free markets, recognizing that the free market will tend to gravitate to monopolistic solutions simply because every business wants to rule the world?
Yeah, and also just to comment on your question, Arun, and on the commercial side of the world, right? And an example over there, where it's worked, right? Like the idea of wanting to, take these individual organizations or factions and having them, be in a centralized place, or pushing a lot of those decisions up the food chain, right? Like on the commercial side, that's certainly happened. Just looking at like the telephony industry, That certainly happened where, it's really been pushed to those centralized things. So it does work. It's not flawed. It just does this work in the constraints of the military, and what's the right balance there, to strike between the two.
My sense is, and I may not have this history right, that we really started hearing the phrase JADC2 being used as part of thinking about a fight in Indo-PACOM theater, China fight. Okay, when I think about then leveraging what you just described as commercial best practices, technical best practices, but then porting it over to something that the Pentagon has to think about as this high-end fight in the Indo-PACOM theater. David, talk about sort of war game it for us. What are the geographical challenges? What are the connectivity challenges? What are the adversarial induced challenges to this kind of connectivity you're proposing here?
Right. So thank you. And thank you for teeing it up so well, because I would say first, the geography is huge. I mean, we're talking about the Pacific, which up until recently, commercial SATCOMs were very limited. And yes, you may have had some military comms, but they were incredibly low bandwidth. And so that was one constraint, was the geography. And it's worth knowing that even in World War II, just for radio purposes, the Pacific theater was actually more difficult than the Atlantic because of the nature of weather conditions and weather phenomenon. There were often times where Pearl Harbor could not know for sure if a naval commander had actually gotten the instructions, and the naval commander could not know if Pearl Harbor had gotten relayed back. So this has been a problem in the Pacific dating back to radio, let alone talking about now SATCOMs and telephony. The other geopolitical problem is now Huawei has been rolled out to most of the Pacific. And so one has to assume that there is a chance that as you send information that's riding over the internet and or over cell towers, it might be piggybacking on something that is adversarial to begin with. And I think that's a very real thing. And this gets back to friend and colleague Vint Cerf. I remember we went to DARPA Stowe back in 2019, and we pointed out that in the TCP/IP routing table, so the protocols that make up the internet, there was no specific identification of the hardware saying I'm with Team Blue versus I cannot verify I'm with Team Blue. There's nothing in TCP/IP that takes the time natively to say this is a node that you're more comfortable talking with versus another one. And then similarly, as things are routed, it's just trying to find the best path. Yes, you can bolt on secure border gateway protocol, but that's an add-on. And we have seen cases where mysteriously large swaths of internet traffic have been routed to a less than friendly nation for some mysterious purposes. And so, so everything we're trying to do, given the large geography, the fact that there may be complicated, compromised geopolitical equipment in situ. And then on top of it, again, with our friends, we've got different allies ranging from Japan to South Korea to Philippines and others that will have different capabilities, let alone different standards for their own military kit. So if we actually wanted to have combined effects across those different friends and allies in a Pacific conflict, I assure you that if you wait to build the perfect, you'll be waiting a very long time. I think it really does have to be a bottoms-up approach that then comes together as whatever threat presents itself and whatever adversary activity is impacting it.
And you didn't go into it, but this is on top of, on the day when the hot war breaks out, there's people shooting our stuff down.
Yes, we should assume stuff is being shot down. Stuff may already be compromised. In fact, there's increasing evidence that we have launched things in orbit commercially that was already compromised before it left ground. So they may be listening in. And so it's both shooting down, it may be using it as TTPs. And I would assume if the adversary gets a vote, they will want to either have us massively distracted from the things that really matter or just stretched so thin. And so part of this is not only just making sure you do have the comms necessary for command and control, but then you have enough information to figure out what are the things I should really be paying attention to as the adversary is trying to win.
Okay, when you're thinking about a system then that important, but also potentially that fragile, I guess over the years I've heard two different versions of this. One is you need to buy a system from a single integrator because then you know where it came from, You can assure its security, its reliability. There's a single group that can help you fix these things. And probably that group is already intimate deeply with the operational challenges. You're better off going that route. Think our nuclear weapons complex. There's another group that comes and tells us, no, you have to be keeping up with the agile, modern, innovative commercial marketplace. You need this heterogeneous system. There is some value and security in that heterogeneity in and of itself, plus you get all that innovation. Both are very compelling. Tell me why one is better or another, because I think this ties down into your top-down versus bottoms-up approach. So either Courtney or David, who's right?
I'll give the abstract answer, then I'll let Courtney give the more detailed boots on the ground answer, if you're willing, Courtney. So this is what I saw when we had to respond to the events of anthrax, as well as later the original coronavirus in 2003, which was, if you don't have to respond to a turbulent, changing environment, then a top-down approach can work. But if we're assuming that there's not just the day of the things get hot, but we're living in a world in which there's multiple technology curves happening in terms of what's possible with SATCOMs, there's multiple curves of what's happening with drones and IoT. The trouble with a top-down approach is it will ossify you in place to whenever you let the contract. And by the time you get, even if the vendor is well-intended and doing everything right, by the time they roll out the perfect system, I guarantee you technology is moving on. And so if we're to really leverage the strength of the United States, which is, yes, we are sometimes chaotic. Yes, we are sometimes freewheeling. Yes, sometimes we do the wrong thing, but we also have strengths to bear. Then you have to approach the agile approach by keeping it simple. So again, I'm pushing back against folks that throw DevSecOps or digital twinning into MOSA, but you have to keep it simple. But that's the only way you can bring the more recent capabilities to bear and keep them up to date. Both up to date in terms of capabilities, but also up to date in terms of security, protocols, and the like. But that's the more abstract answer. So now I'll go to Courtney to give the boots on the ground answer.
Yeah, and so certainly, right, it's always a little bit of, it depends, depending on what the situation is, right? Traditionally, when you think of, one large systems integrator, you think of a more stovepipe proprietary, solution that just kind of slowly gets upgraded, over time, where when you think of maybe having smaller, more agile, more of a heterogeneous mixture of companies, that are maybe all speaking the same language throughout the process, and being able to develop a little bit, more quickly, I can certainly see where both have their place. But, for me personally, in terms of my opinion between the two, different ones, I certainly think that more of the heterogeneous style is more advantageous for the U.S. and for our warfighters. One of those reasons is if we're talking from a cybersecurity perspective, you can certainly talk about, okay, well, if you have these different mixture of systems, then if they potentially are able to compromise one, maybe they can't then get in and compromise them all, right? And so you have a little bit more of that, resiliency, with that approach, where versus if you just have the one, very large system, then certainly, once they're in, they're kind of in, depending on how the system is set up. And then also, because we do live in a technologically advanced age, we do have to keep up with that. And so, when you have those smaller companies maybe focusing on certain pieces of the pie or certain warfighting functions of the pie and working together with other people, you have more of a collaborative, community, and you're able to really keep up or pace yourself with the rate of technology change versus always really having to kind of chase it or being behind with a larger, kind of more legacy system.
The other thing, Arun, is I would say there's two additional proof points empirically we can call out, which was, so FirstNet in the United States was rolled out to try and make sure we had interoperability amongst first responders between police officers, firefighters, ambulances, and the like. And that was partly because we didn't. And there had actually been some very tragic cases, whether they would be actual natural emergencies or human-caused emergencies. And that was actually a response because even prior to them, there had been a contract that had been let to a large telecommunications company that remained nameless, and it hadn't worked out in producing interoperability. So FirstNet tried to do it again, and that still hasn't really worked out. And so we have seen two bites at the apple to try and say, let's award it to a single prime, and it's not worked in the domestic front. And that's in the domestic front where no one's trying to actually take down the gear as far as we know. At the same time, on the more positive, hopeful note, ATAC, the warfighter's Android operating system, that's an example of a more decentralized distributed approach where there was rigor placed on how do you interface through the modules through APIs, again, much like MOSA, but it wasn't overcomplicated, and that actually showed value. But it did require, and I think this is the key, it requires discipline on the part of the Department of War's personnel to say, yep, that's keeping it simple and achieving interoperability. Nope, that's not. And if you lose that expertise or if you lose that leadership, then yes, the more decentralized distributed approach unfortunately morphs into something that's a mess.
Yeah, TAC is an example actually we just covered recently in a podcast with some friends at Booz Allen that grew out of some department S&T work and is turned into what people think we don't have any examples of, an open systems architecture that folks can plug into, and it's working reasonably well. But I guess my harder question on all this is not, can we overcome culture and the bureaucratic process and all that? It's very basic. What you're describing is a very sophisticated customer who knows how to buy these things rather than hiring a general contractor to build their house for them. Are you describing too sophisticated a customer?
Well, that's why we do these podcasts, right? So I hope we can find people who are willing to do the service to help the customer ask better questions and make better demands of the private sector. I think you can find people that are willing to do it, but recognize it's going to be a labor of love. I mean, I'm not naming specific names, and this is actually not even Department of War specific, but I know there was an acquisition professional for a space organization with the US government who did absolutely the right thing. But unfortunately, there was an industry incumbent, none of whom is here, who decided that because the contract was not awarded in a sole prime status, it was more the interoperable approach, to unfortunately go after him personally. And so I think we need to be recognized that, while on the one hand, there is the phrase in business, which is buyer beware, caveat emptor, and I hope the Department of War takes that to heart. Sometimes there's a whole lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and that can also go after, unfortunately, people who are trying to do the right thing for the U.S. But I think the Department of War can ask the more sophisticated and nuanced request if we make sure we put the right talent in place.
So Courtney, backing away from really hard things like that, bureaucratic politics and political philosophy, something easier like physics and engineering. Tell me a little bit about how the idea of small networks technically already gives you an advantage over giant homogeneous networks when I'm thinking about things like jamming, spoofing, electronic warfare threats. Does the physics and math just say smaller is better?
Yeah, well, really what it comes down to, I think, when you think about the numerous small networks and how that can help in that battlefield threat, like a jamming or a spoofing or any other of the EW effects that we're really seeing a lot in other countries, certainly Ukraine, as an example, is really the resiliency. It already has a little bit of that built-in resiliency when you have these small networks, right? And so, if you have multiple networks and you have multiple paths, right, that is really what's going to help against an EW attack or a jamming attack, right? You're going to want to be able to have that secure and adaptable communication system in that EW contest. Certainly that multipath diversity, encrypted communication certainly comes into play. Being able to use whatever communication path is available, whether that's VHF, UHF, HF, SATCOM, and, including commercial SATCOM, in a lot of those different cases. And so, those smaller networks really help play a role in that, but it goes above and beyond that in and of itself, right? Because there's even certain things with radios, right, with frequency hopping, and that also can help with things like jamming and in those scenarios. But really at its core, really at its base is you just have to be resilient, and you need to have more than one way to talk. You need to have more than one network. You need to have more than one way to get the message across, which sounds, again, pretty simple, but that's, what we try to focus on, because things can get so large and seem so complicated and nebulous, and, really at the heart of it. And when you boil it down, you really want that brilliance in the basics approach, because people have enough to think about in these scenarios. And then in addition to, as Dr. Bray said earlier, when people are shooting at them, it just adds a whole nother level of complication. And so you really want to take a lot of that out for those folks that are at that edge.
And if I could double click on something Courtney said, because triggered a thought. If you did the path, the door one that you mentioned, Arun, of awarded to a single prime, even if the contract said make sure you have resiliency built in, what'll probably happen in year 2 or year 3 is that company will experience pressures to say, well, why do you have these 3 or 4 duplicate pathways? That's redundant. You can collapse that and actually make a larger profit on the contract. Or even the government might say, you need to be more cost effective, shrink it down. And so in some respects, you get what you pay for. and I'm not saying more expensive, but I would say the challenge of a large prime, especially in today's era, is they may over optimize for efficiency, including their delivery of the solution and then profit maximization on their end. But at that very process, this is where the free market approach may actually end up removing resiliency from the warfighter at the very time when they need it. Whereas we know with small scale networks, and we've seen this in other domains as well, in terms of power grid or even just communication on the internet, having resiliency also sometimes means having redundancy, but that's necessary because you never know if that radio is going to go down, or that cell tower is going to go down, or that satellite is going to go down. You need all of them.
Let me channel 2 other angry communities. One,
sure, go for it.
If I was a cost analyst or worse, an appropriations staffer, isn't this heterogeneous approach more expensive?
So it is more expensive if you keep it running all the time. But if you do what Courtney and others are doing, where you have it so that these are comms that you're using for the warfighter on a daily basis, and when the signal flare goes up, or we now think we're in a more pronounced period of not just gray zone conflict, but it's now proxy hot war, then you get the interoperability when you need to do it. So you're not paying to have the system up all the time. You're having it in very specific instantiations. Possibly this is for a very specific group in Indo-PACOM, or a very specific group that might be tied to the EOP, or it might be tied to another high-profile asset. So I would say, yes, it's a good point, but I would say it's more expensive if you're paying to keep it up as an entire infrastructure all the time. But if what you're doing is near just-in-time connections across different smaller networks for the purposes of achieving a bottoms-up JADC2, it's actually relevant today, and it's actually able to come together when things hit the fan.
Yeah, and even I would add to that, when you have one person doing it, the incentive is not always there to drive the cost down, right? When you do have multiple companies working together, in this heterogeneous environment, right, you're going to have that natural competition, and you're going to have, that natural jostling, if you will, where really the customer always wins in that position or in that standpoint, right? So the customer being the government, versus having one person or one prime or one incumbent, that really they have the leverage in that situation.
The other angry community I can think of, and I'm going to merge a couple here, is the training and maintenance community, right? I like getting one system and issuing it to everyone because I can issue one set of training manuals and do one set of training, and then I know where to get my spares from. This is all very clever, but now do I have to train lots of different people on ever-changing systems and have multiple supply chains running at the same time? What's the answer to those kinds of grief?
That's a great question. And I'll take that, Dr. Bray, right? Certainly, at least the way that we, look at it, right, is that, our system that we use, or our software that we use, which is our flagship software, we use that across the board, right? So across all of our capabilities, across all of our solutions, whether it's software or hardware, it's the same thing. So for our customers, right, you have that where it in this environment or in this concept of operations or in this use case. So then if you now are in a, different area of operations and they're using it in a different way, you already have that base knowledge. You're not going to have to learn a whole new system, in that scenario where that is the case, a lot of times with other systems. And so I think that if as companies, or I think if customers, if we can demand some of that, or listen, we don't want to have to be retraining people all the time. We want to look at the .mil PFB, whenever we're looking at new solutions, and we want to make sure we're asking the question, okay, well, what if I want to now do this other capability? Is that now some other thing that I have to learn and train on and configure, and, all the things that come along with that from a life cycle cost perspective? And so our answer is, always no, you don't. But that is, a little bit of a different way, to think about that, because that's not always typical in the industry.
I would also say, building on what Courtney said, because I think she's spot on, you're not going to be using a cell phone in the middle of the ocean, and so you're going to have some heterogeneity allowing for the conditions in which you find yourself in. But I do think thoughtfulness about the UI UX user experience is necessary, and that's where I think, again, the ATAC example is a good example of, there are different modules for TAC, but they're generally all following. I don't know if there's anyone like saying, well, you have this button over here that on all the other apps is over here. But again, just thinking about the UI UX, the other thing that I would say that I'm really interested in is, because we're going into an environment in which there's going to be an increasing number of sensors, whether they be ground, ocean, air, or space-based, and increasingly, I don't know what the best word to call it. I'm hesitating calling them agents, but there will be AI-enabled software entities, for lack of a better word, also assisting a warfighter. I hope whatever we do for those things is not dramatically different than what we're already doing for C2. Otherwise, I think there's just going to be way too much cognitive dissonance. And so there is validity to it, but I would also gently push back and say there's always going to be heterogeneity in the equipment.
So Courtney, and David's experiences, try to give people some hope here that we're moving in the right direction. And I think two promising trends in the way the department is thinking about acquisition might actually lend itself to this philosophy and vision of how they can do JADC2 that you two are talking about. The first one I'm thinking about is apparently this embrace by both the Pentagon and Congress on experimentation. And I think we started by talking about maybe an experiment that you guys ran, connecting lots of different systems into a network. What are you seeing these days in terms of the experimentation that the department is talking about or actually doing that's giving you some hope for the future? And what more would you like to see them do?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, for us right now, I would say we see a majority is experimentation, right? So when we look at across the board at, all the different customers, Army, Navy, Air Force, right? Everyone has their own experimentation as part of JADC2 or CJADC2, right? That they're doing. And so I would say a lot of it is experimentation, right? I mean, even with the Army and the way that they're approaching it with, the prototypes and, the different units with 4th ID and then 25th ID, right? And a lot of that is the customers are really trying to figure it out, right? And so that can make people nervous, right? Because when you're trying to figure it out, you have to assume a lot of risk sometimes, right? And so I do see us assuming, risk, but at the same time, that experimentation, I believe, is necessary, right? Because the only way to know how to go, right, is to kind of go through it and to play with it and to figure out your left and right limits and to do that experimentation. So I think it's a very positive development to see the Department of War have that experimentation and that focus on that experimentation, versus a lot of what we were seeing before, which was just, a lot of kind of just iterative development, kind of same old, not a lot of thinking outside the box, if you will. So I think that certainly is a positive development.
I'll give you two sources of hope, Arun, because I realize we've also given people things to think about in terms of how do we make sure these things actually work in a conflict. One, I can remember just last year for a war game exercise, I suggested that we actually assume that comms might go down for Team Blue and that Team Red was actively trying to take the comms down. And I got pushback, and this was involving the Pacific. I got pushback where they said, that's outside the scope of this war game. That's not happening now. I know there have actually been some activities in which they actually are trying to see how easy it is to compromise somebody's software or hardware. Do you have actual hard passwords, or are they easy to guess passwords, or heaven forbid default passwords? So I see some people actually practicing as we intend to possibly have a conflict. And I think the more we can do that with such situations and simulations and war games, the better. The other thing that I see as hope, and I know acquisition reform is always fraught with peril, but it seems like they are, as Courtney said, taking more of a warfighter-centric perspective. When I look at what JADC2 and CJADC2 was over the last decade, up until recently, it was mainly planes talking to tanks, talking to other vehicles and devices, but the warfighter seemed to be, for whatever reason, not the centric part, even though there was the idea of network-centric warfare. You'd look at the diagram and it was mainly devices talking to devices. And I think it's recognizing at the end of the day, if someone cannot use this in the middle of a situation where they're being shot at and they've got all this information coming in from all directions, it's not going to be as useful. And so I do celebrate that the Department of War has taken a warfighter-centric perspective, and hopefully that'll inform things that are not just things that look great on the storyboard, but actually do work under really difficult and situations where the adversary is trying to win.
Courtney, what you said reminded me that we at ETI have done some work with the Hudson Institute with Brian Clark and Dan Patt on a paper which focused on some of these interoperability issues and as well as experimentation. It was about how we should value experimentation over just demonstration. And so while you were talking, I kept waiting for you to say, but experimentation is great, but what, Courtney? What's next? What comes after that that's missing?
Well, you said you wanted to keep it positive, right? So we're...
What, we can't just have one-offs, Arun, that are like 1,000 flowers blooming? No.
Yes, certainly, you hit the nail right on the head, right? Like, I mean, that's all positive. Experimentation is good. Experimentation is positive. But there needs to be obviously the lessons learned, and then they need to be applied, right? So we don't just want to focus on the technology portion of these things and just, try to fit a square peg in a round hole, let's say. We really want to make sure that we are also having that balance that we talk about, with anything, but certainly with this, where, you focus on the technology, but you also remember kind of that the hard-won lessons of those, human-centric lessons that you've learned from war and in the past, right? Because that's really what will get us, into the future from that perspective. It always makes me nervous when I hear, people talking about removing humans, right? Because I certainly think that that's one of our biggest assets, right? We want to make sure that there is a human in the loop. We want to make sure that, we're not just relying on this technology, just kind of blank check, right? We want to make sure we're training people to, be able to identify when something looks a little wrong, right? And not just blindly trust whatever spit out, on the other side from a technology perspective. So it's not just the experimentation. It's certainly kind of what do we learn from that? And then how do we put that into, that specific, area of operations or that specific use case, or certainly that specific system.
The other thing real quick, Arun, is I love that you mentioned experimentation, but experimentation has to lead to demonstrations or beyond demonstrations, actually fielding. So the word expertise and experiments both have the root experia, meaning out of danger, and that the only way you get expertise is you do dangerous things, experiments. They don't always work. I think, as long as we have a culture that are willing to try new dangerous things, and then from it, as Courtney said, field it. And if anything, we should be using these technologies in situ as to what we are doing in the Pacific right now, even with just pronounced gray zone conflict. And we should, the last thing I would say, and I know we had this conversation with Jeff Wright as well, we need more doctrinal practices and exercises where there is a fog of war and you don't immediately know what's happening. Because I feel like the last 2 decades, unfortunately, in other conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, deluded us to think that we would have Overwatch capabilities and we would know more than we possibly will in a near peer conversation. So I would like to see more experiments leading to expertise that is actually fielded, and at the same time also at the troop level, squadron level, battalion level, more exercises where we do have a pronounced fog of war.
Okay, last question. We're running out of time here. So I cleverly wrote my first Solve the World's Problems on Network-Centric Warfare piece of legislation, I want to say in 1999. And apparently it didn't work when I wrote it then. To prevent people from writing this still in, let's say 2039, what do you hope for the future to look like, let's say in 2030 or so? And what's the single biggest change you'd like to see on the part of either the customer or the collected vendors to get us to this future of what we used to call network-centric warfare, what we call now JADC2, to get us going in the right place within a decade? So, Courtney, you've got the magic wand. What would you like to see change and happen here?
Yeah, so there's certainly a couple things that, I can think of just, off the top of my head. Certainly one of them is a lot of what we're talking about with a bottoms-up approach and a warfighter-centric approach, right? Because what happens when we get into this near-peer conflict, right? If we're following this top-down approach, right, we know that there will be a time when those networks are down or those tools are not available, either all or in part, right? It doesn't even have to be all, right? It doesn't have to be the big flashbang. It can just be, a portion of any of those, right? There's going to be a time when the, shared cloud-based data pool is not reachable. There's going to be a time when, that near zero latency, disappears. There's going to be a time when that AI, ML, machine-enabled insights are compromised and you can't trust it, right? And so really, when that happens, it becomes, what will we do? And really, from where I sit and from what a lot of I see in a lot of the conversations that we have here at REDCOM, is really then you kind of have to go back, to that decentralized decision making, right? Like built on competence and mutual trust and understanding commander's intent, disciplined initiative and all those types of things. And so for me, it's don't forget those lessons learned, right? Those things that we've learned in the past, right? And don't forget to train on them, right? Because when that happens, it's going to happen. If we aren't used to operating that way, if we aren't used to training that way, then our enemy will win, right? They will have won because they will have neutralized us in some way, shape, or form, right? It's going to, paralyze us in some way. And so, making sure that we still know how to operate and we still know how, even though, JADC2 and JADC2, right, it's kind of going up the chain in terms of, a lot of decisions, get made at the hands of the strategic commander and the headquarters staff, right? Because they can, right? But once something happens, that decision making will need to be shifted back down, and people will still need to know how to do that in that scenario without sacrificing, the agility or some of the precision in that decision-making process. So that's certainly one thing I'd like to see, because if you do that, if you start there, right? If you start at the bottom where nothing's there, right? You start at the basic, you start simple. We just have this right down at the tactical edge. Then you can really start to kind of layer in all the other aspects, that then complement it and help it. And then that's when you get to really see those kind of second, third order effects of those things being involved and those things being in place, but we're not reliant on them, or we're not handicapped, by them in any way. So that's one. That was a long-winded way of saying, one. But my second one really is authentication, right? We talk a lot about, networks and having larger networks or smaller networks, or converging different networks or different devices, and trusting people and not trusting people. And really, at the end of the day, all that boils down to me of how important authentication is, right? It's a small piece of the kind of security puzzle, or even the, zero trust architecture. But to me, it's the most important, because if you don't know that I am who I say I am, and I am supposed to be here at this time on this device, right, then everything else is lost, really, because that's really what it has to start with. You have to know that the people that you're talking to, the people that are in your systems, the people that have access to that information are the people that are supposed to. So, that's one thing that I would like to see, a greater focus on, and make sure we get that right, or those two things right, moving forward.
All right, Arun, I'll give you a very short answer for future policy, and kudos again for leading the way in 1999. I think there's some story we can later a song. I hope Department of War defines whatever we're calling it by that point in time. It'll have moved on from NetCentric to JADC2 to whatever we're calling it at that point in time, as a stated capabilities as opposed to an end state, because technologies are going to evolve. So specify that it's an end state. I would say, and again, I haven't had time to sort of wordsmith this, basically JADC2 is the ability for a commander to both receive and send the information necessary to personnel, assets, and fellow forces to achieve combined effects. And if that is the goal, then I would also specify the boundary conditions of what it's not. It is not DevSecOps. It is not digital twinning. It is, specify what it's not, because that'll actually allow the focus. And then finally put in place the incentives. This is how I often say, if we, and I include myself in this, we don't tell ants where to go. We put sugar in certain places. We put chemicals in other places. We need to have strong incentives. I would love to see, whether it's a commander or whatever, we need to figure out the right incentive within Department of War for someone to experience at least every 12 months, I'd hope every 6 months, an actual event where the ways they are doing the receiving of information, both in and the communication of information out for combined effects, is evaluated. And there is actually a force within Department of War whose job is to make it more difficult for them to simulate that. And that's coming from the intelligence community days that I had, where we had red teams that were playing that part. And I think if you create that forcing function, you will create that demand signal. And again, by saying, here's the goal and here's the boundary conditions, hopefully that will have the discipline to keep things simple and not overcomplicated as we do this approach going forward.
That's great. David gets the last word. I want to thank David Bray, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, and Courtney Stiles, the executive director for customer activities at REDCOM Laboratories, for joining us today. Thanks, guys, for this great conversation.
Thanks for having us, Arun.
With that, I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of Emerging Tech Horizons. Please visit ETI's website to sign up for our mailing list and register for our various webinars, events, and educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all of our latest content. We're available wherever you listen to your podcasts, including YouTube. Special thank you to Melanie Yu, Daniel Park, Wilson Miles, and Elijah the intern for producing this episode. Of course, thanks to Booz Allen Hamilton for sponsoring this episode. Thanks so much again for tuning into Emerging Tech Horizons.